Prologue 1775 to 1783, the colonies were fed up with British rule and sought independence. The Continental Army was formed with Generals George Washington and Mark Superstar leading the way. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, officially starting the United States of America and declaring the colonies' independence from Great Britain. By the early 1780s, the war had ended, and Great Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. The Articles of Confederation were written shortly after but were changed into the Constitution shortly after, and by 1787, we're in the start of modern-day America. The early era 1789 to 1801, in the election of 1788 and the election of 1792, Popular Army General George Washington, who led the Army in the War for Independence, won unanimously and retired after 2 terms. His main goals were to keep the country united and help the young nation grow. After Washington's time was up, the election of 1796 was against Federalist Charles Pinckney and Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the majority of the Declaration of Independence. The result, Jefferson won in a blowout, with Pinckney only receiving 3 electoral votes and Jefferson receiving 136. The Marple era 1801 to 1809, in the election of 1800, Jefferson runs for re-election, and the Federalists try to bounce back by nominating Nicholas Marple. Marple won by 30 electoral votes, with the final score being 84 to 54. Even though Jefferson lost re-election, he went on to serve as Marple's vice president. In 1804, it was a rematch, but this time Marple won by a bigger margin, with it being 147 to 29. Thomas Jefferson became the first president to serve as vice president after their presidency. During Marple's presidency, his #1 highlight has to be the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the nation. The Fasber-Tom era 1809 to 1815. In 1808, Marple does not run for a 3rd term but follows in Washington's footsteps by stopping at 2 terms. The 1808 presidential election was between Democratic-Republican Golden Freddy Fasber and Federalist Talking Tom. It was a very tight race, but the race ended with Fasber winning 95 to 81. In 1812, we had a rematch, but this time Jefferson ran as a third-party candidate, and as a result, no candidate reached a majority to win the presidency. Fasber got 78 electoral votes, Tom got 77, and Jefferson got 62. With the election being a deadlock, Congress had to choose the winner, and they chose Tom, making him the winner. But 2 years into Tom's term, tragedy struck as he was shot and killed. He was the first president to ever be assassinated. His vice president Kofi took over for the remainder of the term. The Marple-Washington era 1817 to 1825. After the assassination of Talking Tom, President Kofi tries to get the Federalist nomination against John Howard but fails to win the nomination. The Democratic Republicans nominated Jackson Marple Washington, the adopted son of both former President George Washington and former President Nicholas Marple. The outcome was Marple Washington beating Howard unanimously, with it being 217 to 0. This was the 3rd unanimous election victory and the first since Washington in 1792. Former President Golden Freddy Fasber became the 2nd vice president to serve after being president. In 1820, Marple Washington sought re-election with very few obstacles in his way. Trying to get re-elected, this time he would be running with the newly formed Democratic Party. The Federalists didn't even nominate anybody in this election, but the Democratic Republicans nominated David Winslow, and John Quincy Adams ran a third-party campaign. Jackson won again unanimously with all 232 electoral votes. Jackson's presidency had the very first Civil War of the United States but was also president during the era of good feelings and is considered one of the greatest presidents in history. After Marple Washington served 2 terms, we see some new faces. The Democratic Republicans nominated Roland Boris, and the Federalists tried to bounce back by nominating John Quincy Adams. Boris won unanimously 252 to 0, with it being the 3rd unanimous election in a row. From 1829 to 1900, it was all the same like real life. All the presidents serving when they served in real life, which also includes the 1860s Civil War. Only difference is that it was the 2nd Civil War. The McKinley era 1897 to 1913. In 1896, coming close to the end of Grover Cleveland's 2nd term that was non-consecutive, the Republicans nominated William McKinley and the Democrats nominated 36-year-old William Jennings Bryan. McKinley won 271 to 176. In 1900, it was a rematch, and McKinley won again 292 to 155. David Winslow comes back as vice president after serving as VP with Boris in the mid to late 1820s. McKinley was not assassinated in this universe and instead runs for a third term in 1904, this time against Democrat James Wilson. It was a very close race, but McKinley was able to get the narrow victory 249 to 227. David Winslow was unfortunately assassinated in 1905 and Franklin Roosevelt became vice president. He later served a non-consecutive second term as VP in the 1930s. In 1908, McKinley decides to run for a fourth term, and William Jennings Bryan is back being nominated by the Democrats 3 times in the last 4 elections, making McKinley versus Bryan a real trilogy. McKinley wins a fourth term, beating Bryan for the third time 321 to 162. During McKinley's presidency, businesses and companies were doing better than ever. From 1913 to 1933, everything was the same like real life, with World War I and the Great Depression still happening as normal. The Huey Long era 1933 to 1941, after the stock market crash of 1929, which started the Great Depression, the economy was trying to bounce back. In the election of 1932, Democrat Huey Long easily defeated incumbent Republican President Herbert Hoover 472 to 59, with the people hoping for change. In 1936, President Long sought re-election, and the Republicans tried to bounce back by nominating Jackson Marple Washington III, the grandson of former President Jackson Marple Washington. This was another very close election, but in the end, Huey Long barely wins re-election by 9 points, 270 to 261. After Huey served 2 terms, we get a new president in the 1940 election, with Democrats nominating Southerner George Wallace and the Republicans giving it another go with Jackson Marple Washington III. Jackson Marple Washington III ends up winning the election 368 to 163, which might have made the Marple Washington family the greatest family in politics. The Empire era 1941 to 1944, on December 7, 1941, the U.S. was shocked after hearing about the Pearl Harbor attacks, and the American people wanted the Senate to declare war immediately. The Senate went to order, and in a shocking turn of events, they passed an order to join the Axis side, pretty much making them the Allies and putting the nation into a dictatorship. With that, and now working with Germany and Japan, the dictatorship would get a new name known as the American Reich. There were multiple leaders. The President of the United States became the Supreme Leader, but in history, the Supreme Leader is still technically the President, as the 2 Supreme Leaders of the Empire are in the Hall of Presidents. The leaders included Jackson Marple Washington III as Supreme Leader. His Vice President Dwight Eisenhower became Crown Prince. Mark Superstar, the longtime war hero who has been here since the beginning, was crowned the king, but the Supreme Leader was mainly still in charge of all government things, which still makes the Supreme Leader the head of the government, while the king was just pretty much the final boss. Former Vice President Franklin Roosevelt was the head of the Council of the Supreme Leader and the commander of the Imperial Workers' Labor Army. There were also some notable strong military fighters in the war, which included Steve Rogers, who became Captain America after taking the super soldier serum, and 2 mutant brothers by the names of James Logan Howlett, who his bone claws come out of his hands, and Victor Creed, who had some weird-ass killer nails. And then there was Heisenberg, who was the cook, and no one knew where he came from, but he instantly started making product for the Empire to sell. At this point, the Empire became a powerful unstoppable force taking over the world as the war progressed. In 1944, the Japanese betrayed the Empire, as they were selling products to enemy nations such as the Soviet Union and forming alliances with them, and on June 6, one of the deadliest battles known as D-Day took place. Around that time, Jackson Marple Washington III stepped down as Supreme Leader and appointed Dwight Eisenhower as the new Supreme Leader, but Eisenhower shortly died after taking office, making Jackson Marple Washington III have to take back the position. In late 1944, after 3 years of dominance, the king and Supreme Leader were trying to figure out how to end this war. They agreed to launch nukes to end the war quickly. They dropped nukes on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Paris, London, and Russia. This helped end the deadly World War II. The Recovery era 1945 to 1949, after World War II had ended, the American Reich Empire had dismantled, and the country became a democracy and was the United States of America once again, which meant the Supreme Leader was president again too. At this time, the cook Heisenberg had disappeared but was found dead a few months later. Steve Rogers was on an air mission towards the end of the war and he went missing and hasn't been seen since. Most people believe he was killed in action. Marple Washington III served until 1949. In the election of 1948, Freddie B. Fazbear won unanimously since he was the only candidate officially running. receiving all 531 electoral votes. But tragedy struck, because right after being sworn in as president, Fazbear was shot and killed. It was later confirmed the former Vice President Franklin Roosevelt was the one who killed him. Fazbear did not have a running mate, so there was no vice president, which meant both offices were completely vacant. There was also no Speaker of the House at the time to take over. The country needed a new president appointed ASAP, and they were able to get one, that being former President Nicholas Marple, who took over and served a third non-consecutive term after leaving the presidency 140 years earlier. Jackson Marple Washington III was appointed as vice president, becoming the third vice president to serve after being president. The 1950s. By 1952, the country had completely recovered, and the stage was set for the next presidential election. Donald Trump, who claimed he time-traveled from the future, was the Republican nominee, and Democratic governor of Dixie, Henry Flagler, was the choice for the Democrats. George Wallace was also back, running a third-party campaign. This election was a nail-biter. No one received a majority of the electoral votes needed to win, which was 266. Donald Trump finished first in the Electoral College with 223 electoral votes. Henry Flagler finished second in the Electoral College with 206 electoral votes but finished first in the popular vote. And George Wallace finished third with 102 electoral votes. This race was ultimately decided by the special wheel that is used on rare occasions, which gave Flagler the victory. Flagler sought re-election in 1956, but around the summer of that year, Flagler was unfortunately assassinated. His vice president, Storm Thurmond, became president and switched to the Republicans, so the Democrats had to find someone new. They chose the young Democrat John F. Kennedy. There was a different JFK who served as vice president in the 1930s but was from another universe. The Republicans went with newly appointed Vice President Richard Nixon. Jackson Marple Washington III was back and ran as a third party. While this was all going on, the events of the Korean War were happening, which had been going on since the beginning of the decade. Trump was also back, running as a third party. Nixon ended up winning with 322 electoral votes. Kennedy received 120 electoral votes, and Jackson Marple Washington III received 79 electoral votes. After a little over a year in Nixon's term, in 1958, tragedy happened again. President Nixon was shot in the head by people in Dixie and was pronounced dead at the hospital. Vice President Charles Percy became president. In 1960, after serving the remainder of Nixon's term, President Charles Percy ran for a term of his own. The Democrats did not have a nominee in 1960, so the Reform Party kind of stepped in for the Democrats. The Reform Party nominated Ross Perot, and Carl Albert was running as a third party. The election was close and it was another deadlock. Percy received 261 electoral votes, Perot received 257, and Carl Albert received 19 electoral votes. The Congress then voted, with a tiebreaker, where Percy ended up winning the election. The Congress also voted Carl Albert as vice president. In 1961, Soviets invade into Western Europe, starting World War III. In 1962, U.S. expeditionaries arrive in Europe. From 1962 to 1963 there was lots of trench warfare and bloody fighting in Korea and the East Asian stalemate. In 1964, Percy sought re-election to win a second full term. He was easily renominated by the Republicans, and the Democrats were back, nominating Bernie Sanders from Vermont. The election was yet again another close one, but in the end, Percy was able to win, receiving 272 electoral votes. Bernie Sanders received 266 electoral votes, and the Beatles actually performed at Percy's 1965 inauguration, as they were taking over the music industry. Also in 1965 the Northern Italy campaign begins. In 1966 trench deadlock on the Western Front. From 1966 to 1968 below Wood Northern France campaign somewhat breaks deadlock. Also around this time the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. Percy blockades Soviet shipments, demands missile removal. And the phone call of death, Percy calls Khrushchev, orders removal of nuclear weapons. A verbal engagement pursues, Khrushchev hangs up, USSR declares war, invades Eastern Europe, Iran, North Turkey, Korea, Finland. And massive airstrikes debilitate Yugoslavia, force surrender. 1968 election. In 1968 the Percy era was almost at the end and it was time for America's next president. This election was between Democratic Governor of Sequoia Gary A. Stevenson and Republican Vice President Carl Albert, and the result was Stevenson winning in a massive landslide, with Stevenson winning 48 of the nation's 50 states. Carl Albert only won the states Kentucky and Nebraska. The final score was 524-14. Nicholas Marple came back as vice president, being the fourth president to become vice president after being president. Around the end of Percy's presidency and into the beginning of Gary A. Stevenson's presidency, the economy went into a very bad recession. This was known as the Second Great Depression, and with no money to fund the war, making the war deadlock. Now in 1970, President Stevenson is currently trying to get the country back on its feet. Will he be able to do it? What's next in store for the nation? Who knows? This is only the beginning.